Hello, everybody. I would like to thank you for joining us here today for ABIS webinar on sustainable finance. We will be talking today about the evolution of the regulation in the financial sector and how financial institutions are improving their engagement with stakeholders. My name is Katarina Halushkova, and I'm the communication coordinator at ABIS, the Academy of Business and Society, that organized this webinar. We are having three experts today. Ismail Ertürk, Senior Lecturer in Banking at Alliance Manchester Business School. Hello, Ismail.
Hello.
As a second speaker, we will have Felipe Calderon, head of the Washington Graduate School of Business at Asian Institute of Management. Hello, Felipe.
Hello.
And Jakob Thomae, managing director at 2-Degree Investing Initiative. Hello, Jakob.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
This webinar is going to last up to 1 hour. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time to answer your questions. So if you would like to ask anything to our speakers, please feel free to write them down during the whole webinar, throughout the webinar. You can see the questions sector at on your panel, on your GoToWebinar panel. And now I will give the floor to Ismail, our first speaker, very soon, so that we can start.
Okay. Right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Right, okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this important topic of sustainable finance. What I will do, I will bring a business school perspective on the key issues about sustainable finance, and then focusing on the regulatory framework, especially in the banking sector, and also on the investment side about the engagement of shareholders. And then Felipe will look at as a practitioner on the credit side of things, and then Jakob will look at the capital markets and investor side of things. Now, my purpose today is really to underline how we need to rethink some of the key concepts when we're talking about risk and stability, and then how those things can influence or should influence the regulation and the shareholder engagement. Now, I will start by looking at a very recent public announcement by the Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, and the French Central Bank Governor. This was in The Guardian about 2 days ago, and they were announcing the new report by the Network for the Greening the Financial System. So really the message there is very clear, how the financial sector must be at the heart of tackling the climate change. So this really shows how important it is, the subject, and then how the regulators have to be involved in achieving the objectives of reducing the climate change-related heatings. Now, one of the key concepts that they use, and then you can see that they refer to something called Minsky moment. Now, Minsky is not a very well-known economist, but he became very famous after the 2007 crisis. Now, they use the Minsky moment to refer to a sudden collapse in asset prices. Now, I would like to use also Minsky as a reminder to us that we need to think new paradigms in defining risk and management of risk, because Minsky was different than what we call heterodox economists in the way the business cycles happen, and then he developed a model, a framework where the financial crisis was endogenous. So that was a very important contribution, and he's a Keynesian economist. But what is, I think, important, whether it's Keynesian or mainstream economists, but the key thing that we can also learn from Minsky is how we define risk and an endogeneity of financial institutions, creation of credit. So I think that's something that's very important, that the regulators are referring to this economist who's not very well read and taught. So as business schools, we try to change our curriculum so our students, when they graduate, they are equipped with the kind of conceptual frameworks that can address and then deal with the climate risk. So really, I'm proposing, and then that's something that we can do with the industry, how we can rethink finance theory for sustainable finance. And in particular, there's a way of thinking where there has to be a particular return for shareholders, for capital providers, and it has to be risk adjusted. So I think when we, like the Carney and other important regulators, see environmental risk so important for financial stability, then how do we rethink risk, especially the kind of risk measurements that we use that are historically driven, and then use statistical understanding of risk expressed as standard deviation and correlation and correlation coefficients. Now, in that context, we also have a vocabulary to talk about patient capital and then short-termism. Now, especially in the investment field, increasingly there's a criticism of short-termism. But then, how do we operationalize what a patient capital should be? Well, what kind of new understandings of risk and return we should bring to patient capital? I think those are the important concepts that we need to rethink. Now, this means putting finance as governance to achieve environmental sustainability. I mean, finance has always been in finance theory and also in practice acted as governance on company behavior to achieve especially financial returns. But now increasingly, like the G20 Green Finance Study Group, which is growing in size internationally, and they're looking at these 5 principal research topics: greening the banking system, greening the bond markets, greening institutional investment, risk analysis, and then measuring progress. I think these research topics would also require rethinking how we define risk, how we present to the investors, and then how the regulators measure risk and think about the capitalization of banks. Now, this is from the report by Network for Greening the Financial System. So we have a clear sort of public picture why regulators and central bankers are concerned. So they are taking it really seriously. On the right-hand side, you see the capital market related corrections in the market due to environmental risk. You have credit banking sector related losses. Obviously you have the insurance, but other operational risks as well. And then there are 6 proposals for the network for green financial system. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would like to concentrate on the recommendation number 4, which is building awareness and intellectual capacity and encouraging technical assistance and knowledge share. I think intellectual capacity is where we need to also invest as much as investing in day-to-day model. So that's what I would like to really, as a business school academic, where it would be good to develop a relationship with the sector. Now, of course, we already have a development of quantification and discussion of risk, as it is known, ERA, environmental risk assessment, and there are various studies on that one. But as this lessons from practice section from the report shows, the third one, the ERA innovation is being led by large international financial institutions, but they work independently and sometimes in collaboration. But these tend to be not shared. I think that's the other thing, how we can learn from big institutions' findings, because they have the resources and open up the debate about developing the environmental risk assessment. Now, what I would propose is, and what surprises me is, although it is led by the central banks, the need for assessing risk, especially in lending, and then we have a very strong framework, Basel framework, where banks keep capital by using the Basel risk-weighted capital approach. Now, I was very surprised that there was no reference to Basel, and I haven't come across in Basel's new sort of adjustments to the Basel how they will take environmental risks on board. I think what I would like to emphasize here is Basel is very much is relying on a risk, as we understand, standard deviation, volatility, correlation coefficient, whereas uncertainty is another way of looking at a risk. And then in practice, companies are using scenarios to deal with it. But Basel needs to think about how they can bring scenarios and discussion on scenarios to complement their understanding of risk, which is primarily statistically and standard deviation driven. So what I would propose is Basel needs to think about green credit risk weights explicitly, and then also we need an international governments to supplement Basel, where we have an institution within Basel or BIS or elsewhere standardizing green in finance, and also create a database of environmental costs. Now, moving on to the investor side of things, we have seen from Larry Fink's recent letters to the CEO, BlackRock manages $6 trillion of assets, the largest asset management firm, and then he keeps emphasizing long-term approach in companies, and then how the investors would prefer, because the societal preferences are changing, and then the younger generations they care more about the environment, but it's also not just the choices about what kind of world the new generations will live, but also there's a financial fact that they will be inheriting their parents' financial assets very soon, and then those financial assets are estimated to be, in trillions. So that means the asset management industry have to take into consideration what kind of risk return calculations those a new generation of investors would like to use. So again, from my views on this one, I think we need to move from a deductive to inductive risk return measures and then risk profiling. Because when I look at the ESG investment research, it emphasizes that there are benefits from lower cost of capital, lower volatility, outperformance on return, which I would think is still an old way of thinking about risk return. And then ESG is about non-financial risks on sustainability. Then should not be solved by incorporating non-financial preferences of investors rather than using the old paradigm of volatility outperformance. And inductive risk return measures of ESG would require a survey of investors to identify non-financial preferences for a new type of risk profiling, and then this kind of risk profiling can move from mainstream theory, finance theory, industry-defined risk return choices to consumer investor-led choices, what I would call self-risk profiling. And then that would involve a more granular ESG risk return choices, where each letters in ESG are made transparent to investors, and return and value rather than return and risk are interrelated. And explicitly ESG factors shouldn't be seen as an add-on non-financial risk, but should be embedded in the holistic risk of environmental and other risks. And that's all from me.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ismail, for your great presentation and your input on this. I would like to ask now Felipe Calderon, the head of the Washington Graduate School of Business at Asian Institute of Management, once again to continue with this topic forward. So, Felipe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katerina. And you can see my slides?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me just, I cannot seem to, okay. So this is a brief outline of the topics that I will be discussing today. So I'll start with a global perspective on the convergence of sustainability and finance. I will be covering experiences in Canada, Philippines, and Indonesia. I worked for the Business Development Bank in Canada for 22 years now. I'm presently teaching in the Philippines. I'll go through the experiences of these three different countries. Okay, just want to provide a definition of sustainable finance from my end. So my experience is basically in commercial lending, lending to for business purposes of financing purchase of property, equipment, or providing working capital. And sustainable finance is a form of financial service where we integrate environmental and social analysis in the due diligence. And sustainable banks believe in the triple bottom line approach of people, planet, and profit. So the way I always explain this to our students is that for a sustainable bank to lend money, it is not enough for a company to be highly profitable, but also the company should be able to demonstrate that it is environmentally and socially responsible. Quick example, I always use Triodos Bank out of the Netherlands as an example of a sustainable bank. This is a page taken from their website, and where they actually explicitly say that we won't lend to any organization that puts profit before people and planet. And also to show that despite this type of focus, Triodos Bank is able to make good money. Sorry, okay, that's the financial results of Triodos Bank taken from their annual report. So you can see that their loans have almost doubled in the past several years, given this very narrow focus on dealing with companies that respect the triple bottom line, and also they're making money. Their net profit is quite healthy despite this focus, and also openly competing with other banks despite this focus on the triple bottom line. So Triodos Bank has branches, I believe, in Spain, Belgium, UK, and Germany, if I remember correctly. So now let's look at the business case for sustainable finance from a Canadian perspective. And this is largely based from my experience working for the Business Development Bank of Canada in Vancouver. BDC is a government-owned corporation, so it financial institution. So the only shareholder is the government of Canada. It provides business loans. The bank does not provide retail loans for personal lending, so basically business loans. And for working there for 22 years, I've seen how they have integrated, especially environmental analysis in our assessment of loans. So customers are required to complete, all borrowers are required to complete an environmental assessment form where they have to disclose their environmental practices, how they dispose of their waste, how do they use the sewage system, do they own tanks, do they have underground or above ground tanks. And in addition to that questionnaire, our managers are required to inspect the property. It's mandatory that we go around the property, walk around the property to see if there's any soil contamination, discolored water, and all of that. In addition to that, we actually, in many cases, hire our environmental engineer to do an environmental assessment of the property. If required, we would actually dig holes to see if there's any contamination underground. And in many cases, in all cases, these environmental reports are paid for by the borrower. So moving on, the business case from a Canadian perspective, again, it's limited to my experience with BDC. First, there's a lender liability. So it's largely driven by environmental legislation, in my opinion. So in Canada, a bank could be potentially liable for the environmental cleanup if they foreclose a property and the property has contaminated the environment. It's possible that a Canadian bank could be responsible for the cleanup of the property when they have to foreclose and take over property. So again, it's driven by environmental legislation. And then point number 2, reduction in value of charged assets as another business case, is that if in the scenario of foreclosing or taking over a property, a company that has defaulted on its loans, the value of the asset could be largely significantly reduced if, let's say, if there's contamination in the property, because whoever would purchase that property would have to clean it up, will have to pay for the cleanup. So, or because of that, I guess, reputation of having a contaminated property would definitely reduce the marketing value of a charged asset. And the third impact, not only in terms of companies that are in difficulty, that are being foreclosed, even for a company that is not in a foreclosure scenario, if it is proven or being investigated for contaminating the environment, then the company would be liable to clean up the contamination. So therefore, there is a third point. There's impact to the cash flow of the corporate borrower. So the viability of a corporate borrower would be negatively impacted if it becomes liable for the cleanup of contaminated property. And the fourth business case is the reputational risk. So if for a bank, even for a corporate, for a company, once it becomes known that the bank lent money to a company that has contributed to pollution or environmental contamination, then that would result in negative publicity both for the lender and the borrower. So that is the business case for a sustainable finance in my mind from a Canadian perspective. Now moving on to my experience in the Philippines after 22 years of banking experience in Vancouver, I took early retirement and moved to the academe. So now I'm now 20 months at the Asian Institute of Management in the Philippines. Because of my background in banking, I have become involved with sustainable finance movement in the Philippines, and it has taken a different. It's quite a different approach in the Philippines. There was this announcement in February 2018. BSP, Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, that's the Central Bank of the Philippines, and IFC, International Finance Corporation, a sister company of World Bank, actually announced in February 2018 that they want to pursue sustainable finance in the Philippines and to encourage stronger environmental and social governance. So when this was February 2018, and I've been part of this movement. I've been a speaker for 6 conferences in the past 1 year on sustainable finance attended by bankers. And what has happened is that finally, the Bangko Sentral, or the Central Bank of the Philippines, has, which is the main financial regulator, has taken on a position where they would not prescribe mandatory rules to implement sustainable finance in the Philippines, but rather they would like to create an enabling environment, meaning they want the banks in the Philippines to establish their own rules of sustainable finance. So where I come in, Asian Institute of Management and the WWF, I'm working with them to create, to help in the capacity building of the local banks in the Philippines, so they understand what sustainable finance is all about, and also to establish their own practice. So this is quite a different take from a regulatory point of view, where the Central Bank of the Philippines would not impose prescriptive or mandatory rules, but would like to create an enabling requirement. And now, actually, in January of this year, one of the banks in the Philippines, RCBC, one of the bigger banks, have decided to implement their own set of environmental and assessment in their due diligence. This is the first mover in the Philippines. What I've heard from Philippine banks, actually, there's been a pushback. Nobody wants to start because they feel they'll be in a less competitive advantage if they impose environmental assessment. But this bank has taken on its own to implement sustainable finance as the first mover in the Philippines. So that is the Philippine experience. Now, my last portion is the experience I have recently become aware of the sustainable finance journey in Indonesia. This is basically just research on my part, very early stage. I hope I would be able to interview Indonesian bankers next month and to get a first-hand perspective on their experience. So what's happening in Indonesia is that the regulatory authority, financial services, has put together a roadmap to implement sustainable finance in Indonesia. So this is a different take as against the Philippines, where the central bank is taking on a position where they just want to provide enabling environment. In Indonesia, the Financial Services Authority has actually prescribed the rules of what it takes to implement a sustainable finance. So this journey started in 2015, and more recently, last year, May 2018, 8 banks in Indonesia have already signed an agreement to implement, to support this sustainable finance initiative in Indonesia. Again, this is desk research on my part. I would like to actually continue this study and make a comparison with the Philippine experience and probably other countries to see how regulatory bodies are either facilitating or not really encouraging the implementation of sustainable finance. That's it from my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for your terrific presentation. We will follow up with Jakob Thomae very soon. He's the managing director at 2 Degree Investing Initiative. And I just gave you the floor to share your screen, Jakob, and you can continue. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I hope that my screen is showing now with my slides. Let me know if that's not the case.
It is.
So, excellent, thanks. All right, so thanks also to all of you joining the webinar today. I think sustainable finance is obviously clearly becoming a moment in time in terms of the importance it has for financial supervisors. I was at the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System conference yesterday, which is a new network of 34 supervisors on sustainable finance with panelists from the governors of the Banque de France, the Bank of England, the deputy governors of the Spanish Central Bank, the Bundesbank. So we're really seeing the elite of financial supervision convening around this topic. So my slides today are going to focus a little bit on some of the investor and capital market activities around sustainable finance and some of the technical analysis that folks on that side of the aisle are doing. And then I'll transition in how that work is being used by financial supervisors in the context of financial policies. So the premise of the analytical exercise that we're seeing now in the market really focuses on obviously GHG emissions. I'm focusing here on transition risk as a case study. And so the point of departure for all data is what you see here on the screen, which is basically a tar sands operation, a coal-fired power plant, right? So it's important to remind ourselves that what we're looking at really are individual assets, industrial assets that are the sources of financial risk and opportunities. And the challenge then is going from this individual tar sands field to global capital markets and how we can interface those two elements. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been tracking through an asset level database industrial assets that represent 75% of global CO2 emissions. So what you see here on this map is a map of basically all global coal-fired power plants in the world. And so these individual CO2 emitting assets allows us to get a full X-ray of what is going on in capital markets and how individual financial instruments are related to GHG emitting assets in the real economy, basically. You can see, of course, with this type of data, how we can move away from very macro analysis to being able to disentangle exposures in the United States versus Europe and various markets across various business segments. And then, of course, also thinking about the policy regime and the physical risk regime, right? So where the coal-fired power plants potentially that are in the eye of hurricanes and other environmental disasters. And then this, I think, evolution is consistent with what we're seeing in finance more broadly, which is moving away from the traditional formats of annual reports and sustainability reports to live data, right? So working with investors now on tracking social issues through social media data, basically, right? So tweets from workers talking about violations of labor standards or real-time tracking of assets using satellite data. And so looking at day-to-day emission profiles of assets using satellite data and changes in satellite imagery. Artificial intelligence, natural language processing come to mind. But in a nutshell, this is really the ability now for sustainable finance to be actually a leader in the evolution of data sets that we're seeing in financial markets more broadly. And that obviously also then relates to the interface between looking at this universe, say, of global coal-fired power plants and mapping it through the corporate ownership tree. So what you see here is the corporate ownership tree of just one utility, Enel. And you can see the complexity of the exercise, right? So Enel is hundreds of companies that are under its wing, and these are just the ones that have even any type of financial relationship. There might even be other subsidiaries that are more passive. And so if you're a capital market actor, it's not just enough to look at the parent company. You might be buying bonds from Enel America. Or if you're a bank, you might be providing loans to Endesa, which is the subsidiary of Enel Generación Chile, which is a subsidiary of Enel Chile, which is a subsidiary of Enel, right? And so these complex corporate structures and contract structures are critical for understanding the financial and also sustainability relationships between companies. And then understanding, of course, that just because your company that you're lending to doesn't have exposure to those activities, the parent company might. And when we do this, have this type of exercise, we're really able to create a map and an X-ray of global capital markets and its interface to sustainability. So what we see here is the case of coal-fired power plants, where those coal-fired power plants sit, where the companies that own those coal-fired power plants sit, who is invested in these companies, and whether those are listed or non-listed companies or non-listed shares. And so in other words, whether we're seeing actually the asset base in capital markets or outside of capital markets or in private placements. And so you're really able to trace financial flows, economic relationships, and sustainability relationships through the system to get this type of a map. And the data coverage is very impressive. I think a lot of the conversations we have around sustainable finance is the lack of data. Through these new techniques, you can really get a comprehensive coverage of global emissions. And like I said at the beginning of my presentation, the data that we deploy in the projects that we immobilize represents 75% of global CO2 emissions. So we can actually trace the individual asset that is responsible for somewhere in the vicinity of 75% of CO2 emissions. So this type of work that we've been doing now is something that we launched in the context of a project around scenario analysis. So the critical thing, of course, is data is just the enabler to measure and then ultimately to manage. And so we put this data together with a scenario analysis tool online with the UN Principles for Responsible Investment in September. We've had 600 investors use these types of analysis just since September of last year. In total, the data covers over 1 million industrial assets and has been used to analyze portfolios worth over 20 trillion in assets analyzed. In total, also taking account the supervisory partnerships, over 2,000 financial institutions have been monitored in partnership with supervisors on this issue of exposures to these asset level data and the consistency of this data with scenarios. So this leads me to my discussion about how supervisors pick this up. And so basically this type of data can then inform what is called scenario analysis. So basically analysis around potential future scenarios and climate outcomes and how portfolios are positioned against these. And so of course, one scenario we're interested in is what the 6-degree world might look like with high physical risk. We're also interested in what a 2-degree, a smooth 2-degree transition world looks like with where we meet the global climate commitments defined in the Paris Agreement. But for much of what financial supervisors are doing, they're actually interested in this new type of scenario, which is one might call a too late, too sudden scenario, or too little, too late, or what others have called the inevitable policy response, which basically means a disruptive, volatile, uncertain future that may lead to very dramatic emissions reduction over shorter periods of time in a less well anticipated way. And of course, these are the types of scenarios that supervisors are interested in when they think about stress tests, because they're the likely to be associated with the highest economic and financial costs. But analyzing these types of scenarios requires new types of thinking. It requires perhaps exploring basically mechanisms around delayed stress tests and also canary in the coal mine type of assessments where you analyze what trend we're actually on. So we did a project with the Swiss Finance Ministry and Environment Ministry where we worked with 2/3 of the pension and 80% of the insurance sector in Switzerland on doing this type of scenario analysis. So one part of the exercise you can see on the right-hand side with sample results is to look at actually the profile of the portfolios. So are we on a too late, too sudden, a 6-degree or 2-degree world? The other interesting thing is the distribution of results. You see on the left-hand side, the insurance companies' portfolios and pension funds in this study. And you can see that even though they all have very similar regulatory environments, they all make fundamentally different bets about the future. And that's an important point. I think just because you don't measure this issue doesn't mean you're not positioning your portfolio against it. Other work with financial supervisors, obviously looking at more financial metrics. So what is the potential market value shock or the impact of credit downgrades on credit rating of bonds, as you can see on these slides. And so what we're doing right now here with this work is really trying to bring together all the different types of risks, right? So for transition risk, but also, as I mentioned earlier, physical risk, using geolocation information to understand exposures to different types of risks. So we're excited to be working with the California Insurance Commissioner that published their scenario analysis using this model in January of this year. We're working with the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority that will be publishing the stress test that we're designing together with them for the European insurance sector in the course of 2019. And then we've also been working with other supervisors, including the Bank of England and the Dutch Central Bank. Now, if you're interested in this, I think it's important to flag that there is not just the materiality assessment, but also about a broader vision for long-term supervision. So how do we analyze the materiality of stress of long-term risk? How do we analyze whether these risks are being managed and to what extent financial contracts have exposure to them? How can we identify early warning signals, and what are the potential tools for risk mitigation? So if you're interested in finding out more, you can of course get in touch, but also check out our website at transitionmonitor.org, where you can use the scenario analysis tool for free. We have sample portfolios that you can test. This is the website I mentioned earlier, used now by over 600 investors around the world. And of course, we look forward to continuing a conversation with many of you on the next generation of sustainable finance ideas. Thank you for your time, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak here at this webinar today.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, perfect. So thank you again, Jakob, very much. And now we have some time for questions. Don't hesitate to write down your questions in the question sector on your that you can see on your panel. For now, we have one question that is directed to Ismail from an associate professor from EDC Paris Business School. So Ismail, the question stands: there is a long-standing debate in academia on CSR performance and corporate financial performance. What is your point of view on this?
I think what I tried to propose in my presentation is we need to move towards a more holistic measurements and instead of separating them into corporate social responsibility, ESG, non-financial, financial, we need to bring new concepts and new rankings. I mean, it can be done by weights, because currently we don't have a methodology, but we can work on it. How we can bring weights to finance and non-financial, and I think we can also learn, bring in the financial and non-financial here being obviously social responsibility and ESG by looking at the project finance, history of project finance. Of course, a different kind of asset class, but conceptually, project finance has always looked at externalities and brought in the stakeholders and then included things like technology risk and then look at the risk mitigation methods. That's the kind of structured finance which existed, but it's not being taught because the way we teach structured finance, especially for the crisis, it moved to using derivatives and options and futures, whereas in the financial practice, structured finance involved mitigating risk, looking at return risk in projects. So I think we can learn from those and increasingly I think we need to bring a governance where the corporate sector moves towards the CSR, a kind of expectations. That's really my answer to that question.
Great, thank you very much, Ismail. I hope that it answered your question. We have another two coming, so we don't have any speaker addressed to it. So whoever feels that wants to give an answer to the question, please feel free. The question stands: what can we do to decrease lobbying?
So I'm happy to try to give a brief answer here. There's actually a great organization that's doing work on that. It's called Influence Map. And what they're doing is they're assessing companies purely on their lobbying performance. So they're really saying, we're not looking at any other parts of the company, of the business that a company is doing. The theory of change is that all sustainability comes from policymakers. And so companies do bad things because policies don't work. And so we need lobbying to stop. And as long as they lobby for bad policies, we will have bad companies. So I really encourage you to check out what they're doing. They've been working with investors who are filing shareholder resolutions that require companies to stop funding organizations that lobby against climate policies, for example. And there have been some successful case studies in the past. If you check out their website, you could have a look at those. And I think investors can really play a critical role here in saying, we don't want our money, because in the end of the day, it is, of course, investors' money, to be used to fund industry associations that lobby against climate policies. And we've also seen, in fact, some U.S. oil and gas companies start to leave some of the fossil fuel associations because it's starting to become a reputational problem with investors.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I will add to that one is really underline the notion of transparency. I mean, we tend to get this information from NGOs, but we there has to be, I think stock markets have to play a role. Any listed company has to be transparent about the expenditure on lobbying and then what kind of lobbying they have done. And I think that should be part of the listed companies' transparency to investors, and then stock markets really have to lead in that. Now it's not, I mean, obviously when these things come out, I mean, they tend to be politicized, but like the announcements that the central bankers have done recently, how environmental risk is a financial systemic risk, and then in Jakob's presentation as well, a 6-degree scenario where we are in real trouble in physical world. So I think now these are economic reasons, social reasons, not just political reasons why we need to have corporations being transparent and disclosing lobbying activities, and I think stock market should take the lead there.
Thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you, Ismail, for giving an input on this. Another question talks that what is the potential impact of sustainable finance on corporate ESG management? How large is that impact currently in times of low interest rate and a lot of global capital searching for investments? Anybody willing to give an answer on this? Can
I start?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Well, in my meetings with bankers in the Philippines, I have heard that their institutional investors are now requiring them to have some form of environmental and social risk assessment integrated in their due diligence. So that is also being driven by that institutional money or for providers are now actually expecting this from the companies that they invest in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Great. And we have another question that you've mentioned a lot, sustainable finance as that is about environment. What about the other factors of sustainable finance? That sustainable finance is about social conditions such as poverty alleviation, financial inclusion, human rights, hunger, and so on.
Okay.
Maybe just to, yeah, no, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Go ahead, please, Jakob.
Okay. Yeah, it's very good point. A lot of the sustainable finance space is dominated by issues related to the environment, and this is always a question of is that appropriate or not? Because for many individuals, especially sustainability is a very personal thing. Some people really care about certain sustainability issues and then versus others, and I think a lot of the focus on climate is also a function of the actual priorities that investors place on different sustainability issues, for better or worse. But there are some very interesting initiatives both articulating these different fields and launching, new aspects. I mean, there's the Just Transition Initiative from the London School of Economics, which is looking at basically the social effects of environmental policies, and so it's really a social question: coal mining workers, and what are the effects of companies on the just transition, if you will, and the social contract. So that's worth, I think, exploring if you're interested in that field. Obviously, all the ESG data providers look at social and governance issues as well. And like I said, there's new data tools that are being explored that relate to social media, and basically using social media as a way to create accountability by companies for their products. And that relates both to the product. So, people saying I ate food at McDonald's and I got sick and these types of things, but also labor conditions, saying, people tweeting pictures from the factory floor and showing the world what the labor conditions are for that certain brands provide. And this is really fundamentally adjust the information asymmetry that has traditionally existed. And so climate change is leading the way because of the nature of the data and the political priority that it starts to represent. But I think some of these other issues are really not very far behind. There's also, which is also environmental fairness, but also outside of climate change in terms of biodiversity and water access. There's the water risk filter from WWF, Natural Canopy Institute, looking at forestry. So there are these growing big data initiatives around other ESG issues.
I think if I can add to that, this is a very good question and very important. I think the quote I took from BlackRock's letter to the CEO explicitly refers to those social issues about automation, threatening labor conditions, but also the increase in inequality and then growth without inclusiveness. Now, all mainstream international financial institutions, including IMF, OECD, they acknowledge that increase in inequality is not good for economic growth, and obviously investors have a role to play, because as we all know, the pension funds are important investors, and then they invest ordinary people's savings. So there's, I think, a governance mechanism that needs to be used. But also, I mean, the previous question about the low interest rate environment and search for a yield. I think we need to have central banks. They emphasize their role, especially in environmental issues, regulating the financial system. But I think they should also look into the other role of monetary policy, and they should produce a set of data about how quantitative easing, for example, creates inequality, because we all know owners of financial assets and real estate, they benefit more from current environment of low interest rates. So we need central banks leading and producing data that's not just about inflation and unemployment, but also the quality of employment being created, increasing inequality, because we have measures of this, but they have to be officially reported, and also look at the corporate behavior, not just about investing for environmental sustainability, but also we need to look at what they do with the profits they generate, increasingly, for example, share buybacks. We need to bring a mechanism. Is it the best way of using corporate resources? And also look at the lack of investments and its consequences for employment. Because ultimately those things will lead to lower wages and lower economic growth and social issues, as BlackRock has written as well. I mean, I keep saying BlackRock because this is a big financial asset manager, but other asset managers are aware of it as well. These things are causing social and political consequences, which are not good even for the financial sector.
If I can also add to that, there's also a growing trend towards financial inclusion in the banking industry, reaching the unbanked or the less fortunate members of society. Fintech is contributing to that. The use of mobile with cell phone, using cell phones for to provide financial services, and there's a growing trend among banks. I guess investing in this type of solutions to reach the unbanked, so to widen their coverage in terms of financial inclusion. There's also a trend towards investigating the supply chain of corporate borrowers, investigating whether their suppliers in some countries might be using child labor. And again, it goes back to reputational risk. If a bank when it becomes public knowledge that a bank is financing a company with suppliers that employ, for instance, child labor.
Thank you very much for your input on this question. We have another one which is addressed to Jakob. It's a question and a compliment for your wonderful presentation. And the question is if live data, in addition to annual reports data, will become a legal obligation for at least listed companies in the near future. What is your take on this? Jakob.
Sorry, you will have to repeat the question. I missed 2 words. Is live data relative to which data? Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. If live data, in addition to annual reports data, will become a legal obligation for at least listed companies in the near future. And what is your take on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the actual mechanism will be quite interesting because live data will no longer be controlled by companies. So a lot of the live data that we're talking about is satellite data, for example, that companies cannot control. If somebody is monitoring, for example, how many trucks are going in a tar sand, that cannot be controlled anymore. And so that will be it will be really interesting how it changes companies' power over information as live data creates total transparency.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we have a last question because we are running out of time. So how can we engage academics to transform our curriculum in business schools so that our future leaders and managers are mindful of social and environmental elements in decisions?
Can I start with that? So at the Asian Institute of Management, I'm actually leading that crusade to integrate sustainability across our MBA programs, our executive MBA programs, and other graduate degrees. When I teach accounting and finance, I start with sustainable finance, and so always emphasizing the triple bottom line. AIM is also a member of the Principles of Responsible Management Education, PRME, which is a UN initiative. The basic argument of PRME is that business schools is an instrument to, to train our new generation of leaders to become more sustainable in terms of sustainability, more environmentally and socially responsible.
I think what I will add to Felipe is we need to. I mean, all business schools they are involved in various rankings, and we have seen this year Financial Times explicitly introducing social responsibility in its rankings, but also I think it will be good to have accreditation bodies or business schools formally including a weight on how business school teach and research social responsibility, environmental issues. I think we should start from there. But also, I mean, what we do here at the business school, I'm also wearing the hat of Director for Social Responsibility. The university has social responsibility as its third goal. So teaching, research, and social responsibility, they are on equal footing, which means the university provides funds, which means then at the business school we can offer funds to colleagues to develop socially responsible elements in the existing modules or develop their own modules, but also engage with the third sector. Our business school MBA students, they do free consultancy for local charities and NGOs. So that's also contributing, but also learning from the social problems that are locally happening. So I think the curriculum is very important. Engaging our students to project work is important, and also working with companies and local authorities together. But I will emphasize that the accreditation bodies increasingly should formally recognize business schools' curriculum and research on social responsibility and environmentally related issues.
Thank you very much, Felipe, and thank you, Ismail. So on this note, I would like to thank firstly our speakers for their terrific performance and the time that they devoted to this webinar. And secondly, I would like to thank our participants for listening to us for over 1 hour now, and to actively engage in writing the questions down. So thank you very much. If you liked our webinar, we also have different activities going on. Please check our activities that we are planning on our social media channels, mainly Twitter and LinkedIn. And our next activities are in May on the 22nd, which is our annual event, ABIS Knowledge into Action Forum, with Unilever at their development center 4 acres. And the key theme of this year is driving sustainable innovation to deliver impact. We all hope to see you there. So please check it out and register. So I won't be taking too much of your time now. I would like to thank you again all for participating, and I would like to wish you a great day. Thank you very much. So bye-bye. I'm going to end this webinar.
Thank you, Katerina, for organizing it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.